My daughter-in-law ripped the wig off my wife's head at my son's wedding, exposing the bruised, bare scalp that months of brutal chemotherapy had left behind. And the part that still wakes me at 3 in the morning is this. Some of the guests laughed. I did not scream. I did not overturn a single table or raise my voice above the hum of the string quartet. I simply stepped onto that glittering platform, draped my own suit jacket over my trembling wife's shoulders, and placed into my daughter-in-law's manicured hands the very envelope she had spent weeks begging me for. When she tore it open and saw what was actually printed on the pages inside, the arrogant smile slid off her face like wax melting from a candle. In its place came something I had never once seen her wear: pure, undiluted terror. If you are only just arriving at this story, take slow breath before we go any further, because what I am about to tell you is a nightmare I never in 40 years imagined could unfold inside my own family, at the hands of the boy I raised. If you have ever handed your kindness to someone who mistook it for weakness, or watched an ungrateful relative treat your love as a resource to be strip-mined, then do me one small favor. Tap that like button and subscribe to my channel so the rest of this story finds its way back to you. And while you are down there, tell me in the comments where in the world you are watching from, and what the hour is where you sit right now. It genuinely means more to me than you know. I am 70 years old. For the better part of 4 decades, I built a logistics and supply chain company out of the flat, cold plains around Denver, Colorado, starting with exactly one leased truck and a route nobody else wanted. I did not inherit a dime of it. I earned every mile, and a few years ago I sold off half my shares and stepped into an early retirement for one reason, and one reason only: to take care of my wife, Diane. Diane is 68. For the last 2 years she has been fighting late-stage lymphoma, and the chemotherapy has been merciless in a way I did not have the imagination to fear beforehand. It took her hair. It took her appetite. On the hardest days it reached in and took her spirit too, and I would sit beside her bed and watch her stare at the ceiling, as though she were already somewhere I could not follow. The house we had lived in for 30 years, the tall, handsome place where we raised our son, had quietly turned into an obstacle course for her. The staircase alone became a daily cruelty. She needed to be on a single level. She needed to be close to the oncology center downtown, where she went every week to be poisoned in the hope of being saved. Giving her comfort and dignity in whatever time remained was the only priority I had left in this world. Nothing else came within 100 miles of it. 6 months before the wedding that shattered everything, I found the perfect place. A spacious ground-floor condominium, no stairs, wide doorways for a wheelchair, and only 10 minutes from Diane's hospital. It was exactly what she needed. And when I stood in that empty living room, imagining her resting there in the afternoon light, I felt something close to peace for the first time in a long while. Because Diane required round-the-clock attention and I refused to leave her side for long, my 32-year-old son, Marcus, offered to handle the real estate transaction himself. Marcus had once been my pride, the whole of it. I had paid for his education, opened doors for him, and trusted him with a completeness that I now understand was its own kind of blindness. So I wrote a cashier's check for $150,000, the precise amount required for the down payment and closing costs, and I placed it in his hand, believing he was lifting a weight from my shoulders. 3 days later, I wanted to confirm the funds had settled properly into the escrow account. I had a small private plan. I wanted to surprise Diane that weekend with the keys, to wheel her up to that ground floor door and tell her we would never fight a staircase again. So on a crisp Tuesday morning, I drove down to my primary bank branch downtown, walked up to the counter, and greeted Mrs. Donovan, the branch manager who had handled my corporate accounts for more than 15 years. I asked her to pull the clearance records on the cashier's check I had issued to Marcus. Nothing dramatic. I simply wanted a clean paper trail for my files, the habit of a man who spent his life tracking freight. Mrs. Donovan clicked away at her keyboard, then frowned and adjusted her glasses. She told me the check had indeed cleared the previous afternoon, and for a moment I felt a warm flood of relief, thinking the condo was finally, truly ours. Then she printed the scanned copy of the endorsed check and slid it across the polished counter toward me. You do not survive 40 years in the cutthroat freight business by ignoring numbers or skimming past the fine print. My mind is wired to read a ledger the way other men read a face, and the instant my eyes landed on the endorsement line. On the back of that check, The blood in my body turned to cold river water. The payee was not a title company. It was not an escrow account. The full $150,000 had been endorsed and deposited directly into the corporate account of a high-end luxury auto group over in Cherry Creek, the most expensive quarter of the city. I stood there in the hushed marble lobby, staring at the ink, my mind scrambling for any innocent explanation. A banking error, a mix-up of account numbers, some clerical accident that a phone call would resolve. But the routing codes do not lie, and I have never once in my life been able to convince myself of a comfortable falsehood. The money I had saved to buy my dying wife a safe and painless home had been washed, clean and complete, into a car dealership. I did not make a scene. I thanked Mrs. Donovan, folded the printout into a neat rectangle, and slid it into the inner pocket of my coat. My hands were perfectly steady. Inside my chest, a quiet and terrible storm had already begun to turn. I walked out to my car, sat down behind the wheel, and gripped it for a long time without starting the engine. I remembered a phone call from a week earlier. Marcus had asked me to help cover the cost of a specialized medical bed for Diane, $5,000. And then the very next day had called me back sounding strained and apologetic, saying the family trust was temporarily tied up in investments, and he simply could not free the money for the bed right now. Things were tight, he had told me. Things were tight. And yet here was a cleared cashier's check for $150,000, sitting in the account of a luxury car dealer. I started the engine. I did not drive home. I pointed the car toward the leafy, affluent neighborhood where Marcus lived with his fiancée, Isabel. Isabel was 29, a luxury real estate agent who had always regarded our family less as people than as a portfolio of useful connections. She spoke constantly of optics, of branding, of social standing, as though a human life were a listing to be staged and sold at the highest possible margin. I had spent 2 years trying to look past all of it, because Marcus swore he loved her, and because I wanted my son to be happy, more than I wanted to be right about her. But as I threaded through the morning traffic, the scattered pieces of a very dark puzzle began sliding into their places. The drive took 30 minutes and felt like an eternity. By the time I turned onto their quiet, tree-lined street, I no longer felt like a father dropping by to check on his son. I felt like an auditor walking into a crime scene. I slowed the car and eased over to the curb a few houses short of their property, and I looked through the windshield toward their wide paved driveway. What I saw there stripped away whatever illusions I had left. Gleaming under the morning sun sat a brand new, fully loaded Porsche Cayenne. The dealer plates were still bolted to the back, and standing in front of it, holding her phone high in the air, was Isabel. Designer sunglasses, a tight designer outfit, practically dancing around the vehicle as she posed and smiled, and captured herself from every flattering angle for her social media. I sat in my car and watched this woman celebrate. She was posing with a luxury SUV bought with the exact funds meant to keep my dying wife from suffering on a staircase. The money that was supposed to buy Diane's comfort was, at that very moment, reflecting the sun off the hood of a German luxury vehicle. And Isabel had no idea that the quiet, retired old man she habitually dismissed was parked 100 feet away, holding the bank statement that laid her greed out in black and white. I stayed by the car for a moment, just observing. I watched her lean against the hood and fix her hair for another photograph. The sheer audacity of it pressed the air out of my lungs. I had worked 18-hour days, missed holidays, and traded away my own youth so that my son would never know the particular terror of an empty bank account. I had handed over that check with the unguarded, unconditional love of a father trying to protect his sick wife. And they had taken that love, that raw vulnerability, and molded it into a status symbol to park in a driveway. Every click of her camera felt like a fresh insult carved directly into Diane's suffering. While my wife sat in a recliner too weak to climb to her own bedroom, this woman was out here curating an image of wealth for strangers on the internet. The contrast was so stark, so genuinely obscene, that a cold and hardened resolve settled over my heart like frost over glass. I was no longer only a grieving husband. I was a man who had been robbed. I closed my car door with a solid, deliberate thud and started up the driveway toward her. I did not yet know what lie they were about to tell me, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I was going to let them dig their own grave, one careful shovel at a time. The morning air was crisp, but my chest burned with a heat I had not felt in decades. My footsteps were slow and even. Isabel was too absorbed in her photo shoot to notice me, still leaning against the polished hood, tilting her head, flashing a brilliant and empty smile at the little glass screen. It was Marcus who saw me first. He stepped out of the three-car garage, wiping his hands on a pristine white towel, dressed in casual weekend clothes that had probably cost more than my first truck. He wore a relaxed, arrogant ease on his face, and that ease vanished the exact second his eyes locked onto mine. His posture stiffened. The towel went still in his hands. I did not rush, and I did not raise my voice. In 40 years of running a freight company, negotiating with corrupt vendors, and standing across the table from men who wanted to break me, I learned one universal truth. A quiet, controlled presence is far more frightening than a man who screams. I stopped a few feet from my son. Isabel finally lowered her phone with a flicker of mild annoyance that rearranged itself, a beat too late into forced surprise. I reached into my coat, drew out the folded bank statement, and held it out to Marcus, without a single word. I simply waited. He hesitated for the length of a heartbeat before taking it. His eyes moved down the page, across the routing numbers, over the clear endorsement stamp of the luxury auto group, and I watched the blood drain out of his face, until his skin went the gray of wet ash. He swallowed hard, his throat working. "Dad," he started, his voice cracking at the edges. "I can explain this, it's not what it looks like." I kept my hands comfortably in my pockets. "It looks exactly like what it is, Marcus. It looks like $150,000, money meant to buy your dying mother a safe home on one level, was just handed to a luxury car dealership. So please, explain it to me. Make it make sense." He wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, and I watched his mind race to build a bridge across the burning chasm beneath him. Then the panic in his eyes was suddenly replaced by something worse. A look of earnest, practiced sincerity. It was the mask I had seen him wear in corporate boardrooms. "The condo fell through, Dad," he said quickly, handing the paper back to me. "During the final title search, the escrow company found a massive hidden lien on the property from a previous owner. It was a legal nightmare. If I'd left your money sitting in that escrow account, it could have been frozen in litigation for years. I had to pull the funds immediately to protect your cash." I stared at him. It was a beautiful lie. It used the right terminology, it played directly on my instinct to protect my assets, and it cast him as the hero of the story. But a lien on a property does not force a buyer to endorse a cashier's check over to a Porsche dealership. And I let him keep building his bridge over open air. "I had the cash in hand," Marcus continued, his confidence returning. "And right at that moment, Isabel got the call. She landed the executive director position at Ashcroft and Vance downtown. Dad, they deal in $10 million estates. She's going to be securing VIP clients, athletes, foreign investors. But in that world, optics are everything. If she pulls up to a mansion in a used sedan, they won't even let her through the gate. She needed a closer's car." Isabel, sensing her cue with the precision of a trained actress, stepped away from the Porsche and walked toward us. The influencer vanished in an instant, replaced by the devoted, hard-working future daughter-in-law. Her eyes widened with manufactured concern, and she wiped a non-existent tear from her cheek. "Walter," she said, using my first name in a soft, trembling voice, "I'm so sorry we didn't call you first. Everything happened so fast. I didn't want to touch your money, but Marcus insisted it was an investment in our family's future." "An investment," I repeated flatly. "Yes, Dad," Marcus jumped in. "Her first commission check next month will be over $200,000. I'm going to return your entire $150, plus 10% interest, and then we'll find a much better condo for Mom. One with a private garden. I promise you, we just needed to leverage the cash for 30 days to launch her career." Isabel reached out and rested her hand on my arm, her acrylic nails tapping lightly against my jacket, and looked up at me with wide, pleading eyes. "I'm grinding myself to the bone for this family, Walter. I swear to you, I want to land these accounts for one reason. I want to pay for Diane's experimental treatments. I want to send her to that specialized clinic you were reading about. I love her like my own mother. I'm doing this for her." She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around my shoulders in a tight embrace, and the heavy scent of her expensive perfume filled my nose, mixing with the smell of fresh tire wax from the SUV behind her. Then, as though remembering a prop she had staged for exactly this scene, she pulled away and gestured to a canvas tote resting on the hood. "Oh, I almost forgot. I woke up at 5 this morning to make this." She reached in and lifted out a large stainless steel thermos. It's a homemade herbal soup. My grandmother used to make it for people who were weak. It's packed with natural antioxidants. I was just about to drive it over to the hospital for Diane. Please, take it to her. Tell her I'm praying for her every hour. I took the heavy thermos from her hands. The metal was warm against my palms. I looked at the thermos, then at the shining new Porsche, and finally at my son, who was standing tall now, watching me with the serene confidence of a man who believed he had just successfully conned an old fool. 1,000 alarms were ringing quietly in my mind. I knew that releasing funds from an escrow account required a signed release form, one I had never signed. I knew a luxury car sheds 20% of its value the instant it rolls off the lot, making it perhaps the worst liquid investment a person could name. I knew they were lying to my face. But if I detonated right there in the driveway, if I demanded my money and threatened to sue, they would simply take out a loan against the car, hand me back my $150,000, and I would never learn how deep this actually ran. I needed to see exactly how far they were willing to go. I needed them to feel completely, dangerously safe. So I softened the muscles in my face. I let my shoulders sag into the posture of a tired, overwhelmed old husband who was simply relieved his capable son was handling things. I understand, Marcus, I said, forcing a weary sigh. I'm just so frightened about your mother. Her last blood tests were terrible. I panicked when I saw the statement. I should have trusted you. You're a smart businessman. Just please, find her a safe place to live soon. We don't have much time left. Marcus smiled, a genuine predatory smile of victory. Don't worry about a thing, Dad. I've got everything under control. Tell Mom we love her. I nodded, offered Isabel a small grateful smile for the thermos, and turned to walk back to my car, keeping my pace slow and unsteady, playing the relieved and trusting father down to the last shuffling step. I set the thermos carefully on the passenger seat, started the engine, and pulled away from the curb. As I did, I glanced into the side mirror. Isabel had already turned her back and was walking toward the driver's side of the Porsche, phone raised, resuming her photo shoot as though nothing had happened. But Marcus was still standing in the driveway, and he was not looking at his fiancée. He was scanning the street, glancing nervously over his shoulder to be certain I was actually leaving. Satisfied that my car was rolling away, he reached into the front pocket of his designer jeans. He did not pull out the sleek silver smartphone I knew he carried. He pulled out a thick, cheap, black plastic burner phone, the kind you buy with cash at a convenience store, the kind that cannot be traced. Even from a distance, I could see the sudden frantic energy in his hands, his thumbs flying across the little keypad, punching through menus, deleting. The calm and confident businessman of 2 minutes ago had evaporated. He looked terrified. A legitimate executive managing a family trust does not carry an untraceable burner phone, and he certainly does not stand in his own driveway frantically wiping its memory the moment his father drives out of sight. I continued down the street with the warm thermos resting beside me, and a cold understanding settled into my bones. My son had not merely stolen my money to buy a car. He was hiding something far deeper, something dangerous enough to require a shadow phone. And as I glanced at the soup Isabel had so lovingly pressed into my hands for my dying wife, a chilling thought began to take shape at the edge of my mind, and I knew the rabbit hole ran deeper than a luxury SUV. I intended to dig until I reached the very bottom of it. The drive to the downtown oncology center was usually my time to brace myself for the sterile smell and the low hum of the machines. That day, my mind was consumed entirely by the stainless steel thermos on the seat beside me. I carried it through the sliding glass doors, rode the elevator to the 4th floor, and walked into Diane's private room, and the sight of her nearly buckled my knees. 3 weeks earlier, her oncologist had been cautiously optimistic. Her white blood cell counts were stabilizing, and she had even managed to walk the length of the hospital corridor unassisted. But over the past 14 days, her condition had, without explanation, fallen off a cliff. She looked devastatingly frail, her skin pale and nearly translucent, stretched tight over her cheekbones. She was asleep when I entered, her chest rising and falling in shallow, labored breaths. I set the thermos on the small rolling table beside her bed, pulled up a chair, and took her thin hand in mine, feeling the prominent veins beneath her fragile skin. She stirred, opened her tired eyes, and managed a weak, heartbreaking smile. I kissed her forehead and asked how she was feeling. She whispered that the nausea was overwhelming, a deep sickness that seemed to radiate out from her very bones, and that she had not been able to keep solid food down since the previous afternoon. I looked at the thermos Isabel had packed, and the devoted daughter-in-law routine replayed in my head like a poorly written scene. For the past 2 weeks, Isabel had insisted on preparing these special broths every single morning, claiming they were an old family recipe brimming with antioxidants to help Diane regain her strength. I unscrewed the lid. A thick, earthy steam rose from the dark liquid inside. It did not smell like chicken broth or vegetable stew. It carried a sharp, bitter, almost medicinal odor that turned my stomach the instant it reached me. I poured a small amount into a plastic hospital cup, and the liquid ran out murky, hiding crushed leaves and dark roots that floated slowly to the surface. Diane looked at the cup, her face tightening with discomfort. She told me softly that the soup always made her feel worse, but that she drank it anyway, because Isabel went to so much trouble to make it, and she did not want to seem ungrateful to her son's future wife. My chest tightened. A dark suspicion had begun to take root, because the timeline was simply too perfect. Diane's sudden, unexplained decline lined up exactly with the morning Isabel started delivering these daily homemade meals. I thought about the cleared check. I thought about the luxury car in the driveway. I thought about the burner phone Marcus had been frantically wiping clean. These were not the movements of innocent, caring people. These were the movements of two people executing a plan. I twisted the lid back on tight. I told Diane she did not have to drink it today, that I would go down to the cafeteria and bring her some simple tea and toast instead. I watched her eyes close in visible relief as her exhausted body sank back into the pillows. Then I picked up the thermos and stepped out into the hallway. I did not go to the cafeteria. I walked straight to the staff elevators and rode down to the research wing because I needed to see Dr. Nathaniel Cross. Nathaniel was not only the lead oncologist managing Diane's case, he was a friend of 20 years, a man whose judgment I trusted the way I trusted gravity. I found him in his office reviewing charts, and he looked up, surprised to see me outside of Diane's scheduled consultation. I set the thermos on his desk and skipped the pleasantries. I told him I needed a serious favor, no questions asked, entirely off the official record. I asked him to run a rapid toxicology screen, a mass spectrometry analysis, on the contents of that soup. Nathaniel frowned, glancing from the thermos to my face, and asked whether I had reason to suspect food poisoning or contamination. I told him I suspected something considerably worse than contamination, but that I needed scientific proof in my hand, before I tore my own family apart at the roots. Because he knew my character, because he knew I was not a man prone to paranoia or theatrical panic, he agreed. He carried the thermos down to the pathology lab himself. I paced the sterile hallway for what felt like an hour, and was probably 40 minutes. Every dragging minute filled itself with images of my wife suffering in that bed. I thought of Marcus, the boy I had raised to be an honest man, standing in his driveway deleting evidence. I thought of Isabel smiling for a camera, while clutching the money meant to save Diane's life, and the anger inside me was quietly transforming into something more dangerous than anger. It was hardening into a cold, absolute focus. When Nathaniel finally came back through the laboratory doors, the color had drained entirely from his face. He did not invite me back into his office. He pulled me into a quiet, secluded corner of the corridor, away from the passing nurses, and handed me a printed report with a hand that trembled slightly. He looked me dead in the eye and asked, very quietly, exactly who had been feeding this to Diane. I told him it was Isabel, my son's future bride. He lowered his voice to a grave and urgent whisper. The broth, he explained, was not a simple vegetable soup. It was heavily concentrated with a large dose of a specific botanical extract called St. John's wort. Then he laid out the pharmacology in rapid, terrible detail. St. John's wort, in high concentrations, is a powerful inducer of the liver enzymes that metabolize medication. Taken this way, day after day, it forces the liver to flush complex drugs out of the bloodstream far faster than intended. It was systematically neutralizing Diane's chemotherapy. The life-saving compounds were being stripped out of her body before they could ever reach the lymphoma. The soup was not just making her violently ill. It was quietly accelerating the very cancer that was killing her. The hallway seemed to tilt beneath my feet. The buzzing fluorescent lights overhead faded into a dull and distant hum. This was not a tragic medical mistake. This was not misguided folk medicine offered by an ignorant girl. This was intentional, calculated sabotage. Isabel knew precisely what she was brewing in that thermos every morning. She was deliberately poisoning my wife to hasten her death, to erase Diane before the wedding, to remove the one emotional anchor that kept my finances tethered and my attention divided. She wanted the estate, the trusts, the whole of it, and she was prepared to commit murder to reach it. I was no longer dealing with a greedy, materialistic girl. I was dealing with a cold-blooded predator behind a rehearsed smile. And in that fluorescent hallway, quietly, without a single change in my expression, I decided I was going to take everything from her. I walked back into Diane's room carrying a paper cup of pale, lukewarm chamomile tea. She was resting, her breathing shallow but steady. I set the tea gently on her bedside table. Then I picked up the heavy thermos, carried it into her private bathroom, and poured the dark, toxic broth down the sink, watching the murky liquid swirl and vanish, taking with it the physical evidence of my daughter-in-law's intentions. I rinsed the steel with scalding water until not a trace remained. I could have screamed. I could have driven straight to her real estate firm and dragged her out into the street by her hair. But rage is a luxury a man in my position cannot afford. Rage makes you sloppy, rage makes you predictable. And I needed to be entirely, perfectly unpredictable. Leaving the clean thermos on the counter, I walked out to the nurse's station and asked to speak with the hospital administrator. I did not give the full story, because a formal investigation would have alerted Isabel before I was ready to move. Instead, I spoke the one language every private hospital understands without translation. I took out my checkbook. I hired 3 private, thoroughly vetted, registered nurses to guard my wife around the clock, in rotating 8-hour shifts, and I issued a single unbending directive. No outside food or drink of any kind was to reach Diane, under any circumstances. And Isabel was forbidden from entering the room unless I was physically present. The staff agreed at once. For the first time in weeks, my wife was safe. With Diane protected, I got back into my car and checked the gold watch on my wrist. It was exactly 2 in the afternoon. I knew Marcus and Isabel's schedule almost to the minute, because Isabel broadcast every detail of her life on social media. They were across town at an exclusive caterer, spending 3 self-important hours tasting truffle appetizers and imported champagne for their lavish reception. They would be distracted and unreachable for hours. I drove to their neighborhood, parked 2 blocks away to avoid the notice of their watchful neighbors, and walked to the front door at a calm, measured pace. From my pocket, I drew the emergency spare key Marcus had pressed on months earlier, along with a grand little speech about how his home was always my home. It had been a hollow gesture at the time. Today it was the finest gift he had ever given me. The lock turned with a smooth, quiet click. I stepped inside and closed the heavy oak door behind me. The house was immaculate and silent, faintly scented with expensive vanilla. I did not linger in the foyer or the custom kitchen I had paid for. I moved straight down the hall and pushed open the double doors to my son's home office, a monument to unearned confidence, all mahogany and leather and shelves of business books with uncracked spines. I was looking for the cheap black burner phone I had watched him wipe in the driveway. A man hiding a second phone does not carry it into a high-profile wedding tasting with his exacting fiancée. He leaves it somewhere he believes no one will ever look. I started with the obvious places. I opened the desk drawers one by one, sifted through organized files and luxury pens and blank stationery, and found nothing. I ran my hands behind the leather-bound volumes on the shelves. Nothing. I checked the pockets of the spare suit jackets in the closet. Still nothing. The clock was ticking and my window was narrowing. So I stood in the center of the room, closed my eyes, and put myself inside my son's mind. Where does a frightened man hide the thing that could destroy him? I walked back to the heavy desk, knelt on the plush carpet, and slid myself underneath the knee-hole. I reached up and felt along the rough, unfinished underside of the central drawer, and my fingers snagged on something thick and synthetic. A strip of heavy-duty duct tape. My heart gave a hard, rhythmic thud against my ribs. I peeled the tape back slowly, and a small black rectangular object dropped into my open palm. The burner phone. I slid out from under the desk, stood, and held it up to the light, cheap and weightless, and stripped of any identifying mark. I pressed the power button, and the little screen glowed dully to life and demanded a 4-digit passcode. I knew my son. For all his newfound arrogance and corporate polish, Marcus was, at his core, an unoriginal man who leaned on the same patterns his whole life. I typed his birth year, incorrect. I typed Isabel's, incorrect. I tried the date they had bought the house, incorrect. A small warning flashed, telling me I had 2 attempts remaining before the device locked itself for good. I paused and thought back to the boy he had been, before greed hollowed him out. I remembered the golden retriever we had brought home when Marcus was 10, the dog he loved more than anything on this earth. He had named him Rocky. On the keypad, the letters of that name mapped to the numbers 7625. I typed 7625. The lock icon shattered and the home screen bloomed open. My hands were perfectly steady as I moved through the crude little menu. No text messages, no saved contacts, no browsing history. Marcus had wiped the visible data clean, but frightened men grow careless in a panic, and while he had cleared the text threads, he had entirely forgotten the deleted voicemails folder. Resting in the recovered inbox was a single audio file, received 2 days earlier. I pressed play and raised the tiny speaker to my ear. Isabel's voice filled the quiet office, and it was not the sweet, trembling voice that had hugged me in the driveway. It was sharp and vicious and impatient. Tell the doctor to sign off on the terminal prognosis already. If the old woman doesn't die before the wedding, we can't use the grieving family excuse to get your dad to move the commercial collateral into the joint trust. The voicemail ended with a harsh beep. I stood frozen. Now I knew. Commercial collateral. Those 2 words hung in the silent office and rang in my ears like a bell tolling in an empty church. She was not merely waiting to inherit my wealth after Diane passed. She was actively manipulating the timing of my wife's death to seize my commercial assets before I ever understood what was happening. I pressed the phone back into its hiding place, smoothed the tape firmly against the underside of the desk until it looked utterly undisturbed, straightened the carpet fibers where I had knelt, and erased every trace of my presence. I stepped softly down the hall and out the front door. The afternoon air was still warm, but a freezing chill had settled deep into my bones. I did not drive to the hospital. I pointed the car toward the steel and glass towers of downtown because I needed to see Gerald Whitfield. Gerald had been my corporate attorney for more than 30 years, a ruthless and brilliant legal mind who dealt not in emotion or family drama, but in contracts, facts, and cold legal warfare. I bypassed his reception desk entirely and walked straight into his corner office. He looked up from a stack of briefs, his sharp eyes instantly reading the grim set of my face, and set down his pen to ask what was wrong. I closed his heavy door, sat in the leather chair across from him, and told him I needed him to pull the county property records on my retirement assets immediately, because I suspected my son and his future wife were maneuvering to steal my properties. Gerald wasted no time on unnecessary questions. He turned to his monitors and logged into the county real estate database. To understand my dread, you have to understand what that commercial collateral actually was. More than 30 years ago, long before the freight industry reorganized itself around modern distribution centers, I bought a rundown warehouse district in the industrial belt on the edge of the city. I paid almost nothing for the land, spent a decade renovating the structures, and turned them into premium leasing space for high-end corporate tenants. Those warehouses were the masterpiece of my working life. More than that, they were the financial bedrock of my retirement, generating a steady, untouchable stream of passive income that ensured Diane would always have access to the finest medical care in the country, no matter how long her fight lasted. I had deliberately placed those properties into an ironclad trust, structured so they could not be sold, leveraged, or mortgaged without my direct in-person authorization. I had built it to be impenetrable, but as Gerald typed, a heavy, sinking dread pooled in my stomach. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. I watched his face, a face that had defended 9-figure lawsuits without so much as a flicker, and I saw his jaw tighten. The color slowly left his cheeks. He leaned closer to the monitor, reading a document line by line as though he could not quite trust his own eyes. Then he took off his glasses, let out a long breath, and looked across the desk at me, his expression grave. He asked whether I had visited a downtown bank branch at any point in the last 90 days to authorize a large commercial loan. I told him I had not set foot in a commercial lending office in over 5 years, and I asked him what he had found. He turned his monitor to face me and pointed to a scanned legal document, stamped and notarized by a county official just 3 weeks earlier. It was a commercial deed of trust. I leaned in, my eyes moving through the dense legal language, and my heart began to slam against my ribs as the reality of it took shape. Someone had used my warehouse district as collateral to secure a massive high-interest cash loan. The amount borrowed against my life's work was $2.5 million. And there, sitting above the printed line bearing my legal name, was my signature. It was a masterful forgery, mimicking the exact loops and hard angles of my own hand. But I knew, with the certainty of a man who has signed his name 10,000 times, that I had never touched a pen to that page. Gerald pointed to the receiving party on the disbursement details. The $2.5 million had not gone into any account belonging to my son. It had been funneled directly into an obscure holding company, a newly registered shell corporation. He clicked through to the state business registration and highlighted the name of the sole managing director. Isabel Renner. My daughter-in-law had forged my signature to quietly extract $2.5 million in cash from my commercial estate, using my son's access to my private records to slip past the security of my trust. They were not simply waiting for Diane to die so they could inherit. They were bleeding me dry in real time, stealing my retirement out from under me to fund their lifestyle, while feeding my wife poison to ensure she would not survive long enough to see them exposed. They believed they had outsmarted me. They believed I was a naive, grieving old man who would fade quietly into the background of his own ruin. And looking at that forged signature, my sorrow burned away completely, and what remained was a cold and total resolve. I looked at Gerald and told him to lock the door. We had a war to plan, and I intended to win it. Gerald crossed the room and turned the brass lock, the sharp click sealing us in. He walked back to his desk, picked up his phone, and pulled up his contacts. He told me he was calling his direct contact at the FBI field office. That bank fraud and the forgery of commercial collateral documents were severe federal offenses, and that he wanted to alert the U.S. Attorney's Office right now, freeze the associated accounts, and see Marcus and Isabel detained before they could move the money offshore or bury their digital tracks. He was already shifting into the aggressive rhythm of a man who litigated high-stakes crime for a living. I raised my hand and, without a word, asked him to put the phone down. I told him we were not calling the authorities. Not yet. Gerald froze and looked at me as though I had lost my mind. He leaned across the desk and reminded me that every passing hour gave them more time to drain those funds. He warned that if the originating bank discovered the forgery before we reported it, I might face a grueling, invasive legal battle to prove I was not complicit in my own son's scheme. I looked him in the eye and explained my reasoning. I knew my son, and I knew the woman steering him. If federal agents knocked on their door tomorrow, Isabel would instantly become the victim. She would weep, hire an expensive defense attorney with my stolen money, and claim a rogue mortgage broker had handled all the paperwork behind her back. Marcus would insist we had a verbal agreement, twisting my willingness to buy a medical condo into some vague, sweeping authorization for a multi-million-dollar commercial loan. They would drag my dying wife through months of painful depositions. They would delay, obscure, and point fingers. They might even settle quietly, preserving their reputations, their freedom, and their standing. I told Gerald I did not want a messy, drawn-out legal fight. I wanted something cleaner and far more complete. I wanted a trap so precise that they would not feel the steel closing until it had already shut. He slowly lowered the phone back into its cradle, sat back in his high leather chair, and studied me with a mixture of professional concern and deep understanding. He had known me for 3 decades. He recognized the flat, cold tone in my voice, because it was the same one I had used when I dismantled my toughest competitors. He steepled his fingers and asked me exactly what I wanted to do. I told him I wanted to become their creditor. I asked how we could legally take hold of their financial throat without waiting on the slow mercy of the federal courts. Gerald was quiet for a long moment, tapping his pen against a legal pad, his mind moving through the labyrinth of financial law. Then a slow, dark understanding crossed his face. He leaned forward and asked how much liquid capital I could access outside my primary family trusts. I told him I held a substantial amount in secure cash reserves, considerably more than the $2.5 million they had stolen. He laid out a strategy as brutal as it was elegant. Commercial loans, he explained, unlike ordinary home mortgages, are routinely bought and sold on the secondary market. Banks do not always want to carry the long-term risk of a commercial note. They originate the loan, collect the lucrative fees, and frequently sell the debt onto private equity firms, funds, or other institutions to clear it off their books. He proposed that we establish a blind trust, an anonymous entity shielded by layers of legal privacy, and through it approach the originating bank with an offer to purchase the promissory note and deed of trust outright, at a modest premium above the principal, attractive enough that the bank would move the paper without asking many questions. The plan settled over me and replaced my grief with a surge of clarity. I authorized him to move at once. I told him to draw on my secondary reserves, establish the entity in whatever jurisdiction offered the greatest discretion, and buy the paper. I did not care about the premium. I did not care about the legal fees required to expedite it. I wanted to own that debt. Then Gerald walked me through the profound danger of commercial borrowing, a danger my arrogant daughter-in-law plainly did not understand. Commercial loans are governed by strict, unforgiving covenants written to protect the lender at every turn. He pointed to a paragraph deep in the boilerplate, the acceleration clause. Under a standard commercial agreement, if the lender discovers any material misrepresentation, fraud, or forgery in the origination documents, the entire loan is thrown into immediate default. The lender does not wait for missed payments. The clause lets the creditor call the full balance due, every cent of the principal plus penalties, on a fixed, short deadline. If the borrower cannot produce the cash, the creditor holds the legal right to move against the collateral, freeze the associated assets, and refer the fraudulent documents to federal prosecutors for indictment. The poetry of it settled deep in my chest. Marcus believed his expensive business degree made him untouchable. Isabel believed her ruthlessness made her invincible. They thought they had stolen from a faceless bank that would take months, perhaps years, to notice a forged signature buried in its archives. They had no idea that within a matter of days, the anonymous entity holding the power to erase their entire future would be me. I stood, told Gerald to begin the paperwork, and not to rest until the trust was established and the debt was purchased in full, and walked out into the cool Denver evening. I looked up at the city lights and felt a strange, clarifying calm. By buying that loan, I was stepping into the shadows. I was becoming their sole creditor, their silent financial executioner. They had tried to rob a bank and had unwittingly sold their future to the very man they were trying to ruin, and I fully intended to let them climb to the dizzy height of their arrogance before I pulled the floor out from beneath them. I drove home that night wrapped in a strange, hollow calm. The frantic panic of the morning was gone, replaced by the cold precision of a man carefully arming a device. The trust was forming. Soon I would be the silent owner of their fraudulent debt. Now I needed them to feel invincible. I needed them to believe their plan was unfolding flawlessly, because the most dangerous enemy in the world is the one who has convinced you he already surrendered. I dialed my son. Marcus answered quickly, his voice guarded, clearly braced for another argument about the car. Instead of anger, I filled my voice with trembling exhaustion. I apologized for my harsh words in the driveway. I told him Diane was failing fast, that the doctors were out of answers, and that the stress of losing her had made me irrational and cruel. I asked whether he and Isabel would come to dinner that evening, so I could make amends and hold my family close while there was still time. Marcus sighed with audible relief and agreed, his tone sliding back into the patronizing warmth of a son who believed himself in control. I spent 2 hours preparing a simple meal, roasted a chicken, and set the dining room table. When the doorbell rang, I drew a breath and let my posture sag. Isabel stood on the porch in a white sundress, holding a small bouquet of lilies, and she wrapped her arms around my neck and murmured empty words of sympathy about how heavily my pain weighed on her heart. Her floral perfume was nauseating, but I returned the embrace with the clumsy affection of a clueless old man. Over dinner, I kept my hands unsteady and the conversation fixed on my wife, describing Diane's sudden weakness, her inability to keep food down, the terrible sense that the end was drawing near. I watched them across the table, and they gave a masterful performance. Marcus nodded solemnly at his plate with manufactured grief. Isabel reached across the oak and laid her hand over mine, squeezing my fingers, telling me we had to be strong, that Diane would want us to celebrate life, that their wedding would bring a ray of light into this dark season. I listened to her venom, dressed as comfort, and forced a tired smile. Then I withdrew my hand and reached into my cardigan pocket. I told them that thinking about their wedding had made me realize how foolishly I had behaved, That grief had blinded me to the future. I told Marcus I understood now why he had bought the car, that an executive in Isabel's new position needed to project success, and that I had been wrong to question his judgment. I watched the tension drain out of my son's shoulders. The last shadow of worry left his face, replaced by a glowing, arrogant satisfaction, and he actually leaned back and took a long, triumphant sip of his wine. I drew a folded, crisp piece of paper from my pocket and smoothed it out on the table. It was a cashier's check drawn on one of my personal accounts, made out directly to Isabel Renner in the amount of $150,000. I slid it across the smooth wood toward her. I told her I wanted to replace the funds Marcus had borrowed, that this was my wedding gift to them, a gesture of absolute faith in their new life. I told her to use it for the catering, the flowers, every detail she had dreamed of, and I looked at her with wide, trusting eyes and said I simply wanted to see my family happy before the darkness took my wife. Isabel stared at the heavy black ink on the check, and for a fraction of a second the sweet mask slipped entirely, and her eyes flashed with a raw, ravenous hunger that made my stomach turn. It was the look of a predator staring at an exposed throat. Then she recovered, pressed a hand to her heart, and let out a soft, theatrical gasp. She rushed around the table, threw her arms around me, and thanked me profusely, her voice vibrating with a sickening, manufactured joy. She swore this gift would make their wedding the most beautiful day of their lives, that she would honor our family name forever, and she picked up the check with a delicate, possessive grace, folded it, and slipped it into her designer handbag. She sat back down beside Marcus, who smiled at me with a lazy, victorious grin, and told me I had done the right thing, that everything was going to be perfectly fine. I nodded, my expression blank, playing the defeated and generous father to the last. When I stood to gather the empty plates and turned my back, moving slowly toward the kitchen archway, I kept my footsteps heavy and shuffling, as though the last of my strength had drained away. I was barely 5 feet from the table, half lost in the shadow of the hall, when Isabel leaned toward my son's shoulder. She believed I was out of earshot. She believed I was too consumed by my own sorrow to notice the world around me. But the house was quiet, and my hearing has always been perfectly fine. And her voice dropped to a sharp, venomous whisper that cut through the silence with absolute clarity. She smirked, a greedy triumph twisting her features, and murmured that she had told him the old fool was too distracted to notice the warehouse. I did not stop walking. I did not gasp. I did not give a single physical sign that her words had reached me. I let the undeniable confirmation of their treachery wash over me, took a slow, silent breath, and felt a cold, dark satisfaction spread through my chest. They believed I was blind, broken, and beaten. But the trap was set, the jaws were open, and they had just stepped gleefully onto the trigger. 3 weeks remained until the wedding. Against all medical advice and my own quiet pleas, Isabel insisted that Diane absolutely had to attend the final bridal fitting. She framed it as a beautiful gesture, a way to honor her future mother-in-law, claiming that having Diane present would make the whole day complete. It was a lovely lie, engineered to make Isabel look like an angel in front of her friends. And Diane, despite her exhaustion and the nausea that clung to her every morning, agreed because she wanted to keep the peace and to see her son happy. Her hair had fallen out entirely during the second round of chemotherapy, so she spent an hour that morning carefully arranging a chestnut wig, applying a little blush to her pale cheeks, trying with everything she had to look healthy, to look normal, for a celebration she was barely strong enough to attend. I drove us to the exclusive bridal boutique downtown, eased her out of the passenger seat, and settled her gently into her folding wheelchair. The boutique was a glittering white sanctuary of silk and mirrored walls and crystal chandeliers, scented with champagne and fresh orchids. When I pushed Diane through the heavy glass doors, Isabel was already up on a raised circular pedestal, draped in imported lace and beadwork, surrounded by 4 of her bridesmaids. As we approached, the bright smile she wore for her friends faltered for the briefest instant. She looked down at Diane, then specifically at the wheelchair, her eyes narrowing with distinct irritation. She gestured to a boutique assistant and, in a loud stage whisper, complained that the bulky metal chair was ruining the aesthetic of the viewing area and blocking the light for the photographer she had hired to document the fitting. She had me wheel Diane into a cramped, dim corner beside a rack of heavy velvet curtains, pushing my wife out of the frame like an inconvenient piece of luggage. Diane folded her hands in her lap, fixed her eyes on the floor, and pretended she had not heard a word. For the next hour, Isabel paraded around the boutique and treated my wife as a stage prop. Whenever the photographer needed a tender family moment, she would rush to the dark corner, crouch beside the wheelchair, rest her chin delicately against Diane's frail shoulder, and flash a brilliant, teary-eyed smile. The instant the shutter clicked, the smile vanished, and she would rise, smooth her dress, and walk away without a single word of comfort for the woman fighting for her life. Marcus arrived halfway through, carrying a tray of iced coffees for the bridesmaids, and handed them out while entirely ignoring his mother. He stood near the pedestal, admiring his bride, soaking in the luxury funded by my stolen money. The final blow came when Isabel stepped down to examine her veil in a full-length mirror. Diane, trying to take part in the moment, offered a quiet, genuine compliment about how beautifully the lace framed her face. Isabel turned, her expression hardening into open disgust, and did not say thank you. Instead, she let out a sharp, dramatic sigh, crossed her arms, and looked directly at the chestnut wig. She raised her voice so every bridesmaid, an employee in the room, could hear her clearly, and declared that the dark color clashed terribly with the pastel theme of her wedding photos. She complained that the wig looked cheap and synthetic, and that having such a depressing, sickly-looking accessory in the background of her portraits was going to ruin the visual balance she had worked so hard to build. A heavy silence fell over the room. The bridesmaids exchanged knowing glances, a few of them hiding small, cruel snickers behind their champagne glasses. Diane physically shrank back into the wheelchair, reached up with a trembling, paper-thin hand, and pulled her cardigan tighter around her chest, trying to make herself as small and invisible as she could. A single tear tracked slowly down her pale cheek. She said nothing in her own defense. She simply lowered her head and absorbed the humiliation to keep the peace for her son. I stood 10 feet away, leaning against a display table. 2 weeks earlier, I would have thrown that table across the room. I would have shattered the mirrors, dragged my son out by his collar, and screamed until my voice gave out. But that day I did not rage and I did not move. I kept my face slack, wearing the vacant, tired stare of a man too old and too worn to intervene. My hands, however, were not idle. Deep in my coat pocket, my fingers were curled around my phone, the lens angled through a small gap in the fabric, the recorder running. I was capturing every second of it, every vicious word, every sneer, every tear my wife shed. But the true revelation of that afternoon was not Isabel's cruelty. It was Marcus. I shifted my gaze from my weeping wife to my son. He had heard every word his bride had spoken. He had watched his mother shrink in shame. He had seen the tears on her fragile face. For one fleeting second, I saw a flicker of discomfort cross his features. He knew it was wrong. He knew it was monstrous. But instead of stepping forward, instead of defending the woman who had stayed up through his childhood fevers and traded away her own dreams to build his future, Marcus simply turned his head and stared blankly at a rack of silk gowns, choosing the comfort of his stolen wealth and his cruel bride over the dignity of his dying mother. In that precise moment, something inside me shifted permanently. Whatever desperate, foolish hope I still held that my son was only a misguided victim of manipulation evaporated completely. The invisible thread that binds a father to his child simply snapped, and my paternal love died there on the polished hardwood floor, replaced by a cold and impenetrable stillness. They were no longer my family, and to wait, I understood, was essential. But waiting did not mean sitting idle. I wheeled Diane out of the glaring light of the boutique toward the exit, while Isabel remained too absorbed in her own reflection to notice us leaving. Marcus did not follow. He did not offer to help his mother into the car. He stayed behind, wrapped entirely in the shallow world he had chosen over his own blood. I buckled Diane into the passenger seat with care. The drive home was quiet. She leaned her head against the cool glass, her eyes closed, exhausted by the toll of the afternoon, and I drove with my hands steady on the wheel, and my resolve hardening into something like steel. Once we were home, I handed her into the care of the private nurses, made certain she was resting comfortably, and then walked back out to my car. My grief had burned down to embers, and in its place was a clear, bright focus. I drove straight back to Gerald Whitfield's tower, bypassed the receptionist, and pushed open the heavy door to his corner office. He was standing at the window, looking out over the skyline, and turned as I entered. He gestured to the chair across from his desk, and the silence between us was heavy with anticipation. He did not offer pleasantries, because he knew exactly why I had come. He picked up a thick, meticulously organized folder, sat, folded his hands over the cover, and told me the transaction was complete. The blind trust had been established under impenetrable layers of privacy, and through that anonymous entity, we had approached the originating bank. Seduced by the premium buyout, the bank had sold the commercial debt to clear the risk off its ledger. He slid the folder across the mahogany and told me I was now the sole, undisputed holder of the promissory note. The $2.5 million loan secured against my warehouse district was mine. I was no longer the victim of a fraud. I was the shadow creditor holding the power of financial life and death over my son and his bride. I laid my hand on the cool leather cover and asked Gerald what he had found on the money trail. I needed to know exactly where $2.5 million had gone. He drew a second file from his drawer, his jaw tightening with disgust. Forensic accountants had traced the funds from the moment the bank disbursed them. The money had not stayed in the initial shell corporation. It had been moved through a web of secondary holding companies designed to obscure its destination. But Gerald's team had pierced the veil, and he handed me a high-resolution photograph printed on glossy paper. It showed a sprawling, ultra-modern mansion nestled into a pristine, snow-capped mountainside. He told me that Isabel and Marcus had used the stolen funds to buy this unlisted property in Aspen, Colorado, roughly 200 miles west of the city, high in the Rockies, paid for in cash through the final layer of Isabel's shell game, a spectacular winter retreat. Fully furnished with imported leather and custom artwork, purchased while they complained aloud about the cost of my wife's treatments. They were planning to spend their winters sipping champagne in a multi-million-dollar ski lodge funded by my forged signature and my coming grief. The sheer audacity of it was staggering. They had not merely stolen my money, they had arrogantly assumed I would be too destroyed by Diane's death to ever notice the missing collateral. Gerald leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low, serious register, and told me we now held everything we needed to obliterate them. He laid out the legal machinery with cold, surgical precision. Because the loan had been obtained with a forged signature on federal bank documents, it constituted undeniable bank fraud, and under the promissory note I now controlled, any instance of material fraud automatically triggered the acceleration clause. He opened a set of legal notices printed on heavy watermarked paper and pointed to the uncompromising text. Once the default notices were served, Marcus and Isabel would have a short, fixed window to produce the full amount in cash. If they failed, I held the legal authority to seize the Aspen mansion, freeze every account tied to their names, and refer the dossier of forged documents to federal prosecutors for criminal indictment. They believed they were untouchable. They believed they had committed the perfect crime against a helpless old man. They had no idea that they now owed their stolen millions directly to me, and that their freedom hung by a single fraying thread. Gerald gathered the default notices and acceleration demands, slid them into a large manila envelope, and sealed the flap with slow, deliberate precision. He stood, walked around the desk, and held the thick envelope out to me, his eyes locking onto mine, with an unspoken understanding of the devastation it contained. He asked me a single question. When did I want to serve them? I took the heavy envelope from his hands, looked out at the fading city light, and felt a profound, chilling calm settle into my soul. I answered him with absolute certainty. When they have the largest possible audience. The next 3 weeks moved like a slow-ticking clock wired to a charge. I kept up my performance as the broken, grieving father, funding Isabel's endless demands, until at last the eve of the wedding arrived. The rehearsal dinner was held at the exclusive Cherry Hills Country Club. Walking into the grand dining hall, the scale of their arrogance was on full display. Chandeliers pouring golden light over tables draped in imported silk, no expense spared, all of it confident that newly acquired millions would cover every lavish detail. I pushed Diane into the room in her wheelchair. She looked terribly frail, her pale hands resting in her lap, but she had insisted on being there. She wanted to see her only son on the night before his wedding, still entirely unaware of the monstrous thing he had done. I parked her chair near the head table and made certain she was comfortable before I took my seat. It did not take long for Isabel to establish her dominance over the evening. Without my perceived financial oversight to restrain her, she shed the last remnants of her dutiful facade. I watched quietly as she terrorized the staff, snapping her fingers at the waiters, berating a young server nearly to tears because the water was not chilled to her exact preference, ordering exhausted staff to rearrange heavy floral centerpieces, while guests were trying to sit because they obstructed the videographer's sightlines. She moved through the room with the toxic confidence of a queen, surveying a conquered kingdom, loud, demanding, and utterly insufferable, reveling in a power she believed she had finally seized. While Isabel basked in her stolen glory, my son presented a very different picture. Marcus sat at the center of the head table, looking nothing like a happy groom, and everything like a man standing at the edge of a cliff. He was sweating through his tailored suit. He barely touched the fillet on his plate. Instead, he devoted his full attention to the open bar, and I watched him signal the waiter for his fourth glass of neat bourbon before the salads were even cleared. The heavy drinking was a desperate attempt to drown the crushing weight of his guilt. He knew exactly what he had done. He knew the fraudulent loan was a massive federal crime. He knew he had betrayed his father and stood by while his mother was poisoned. Every time I looked in his direction, he snapped his head away and stared down at his polished shoes. He was a coward, paralyzed by the enormity of his own sins, unable to meet my eyes. I sat calmly, offering polite nods to the extended relatives, who drifted by with their hollow sympathies about my wife. And as the dinner service wound down, the clink of a silver spoon against a champagne flute cut through the noise. Isabel rose at the head of the table, her face flushed with alcohol and triumph, and the room quieted. She thanked her wealthy colleagues, dropping the names of prominent developers in the audience, and delivered a rehearsed little speech about love and destiny. Then her tone shifted, the sweetness giving way to a sharp, patronizing edge. She turned her body slightly toward the table where Diane and I sat, raised her glass, and projected her voice across the hall. She said that marriage was about looking forward, not backward. She declared that it was so important for the older generations to recognize when their time had passed. Her eyes locked onto mine with a mocking smirk, and she proposed a toast to the future, adding that some people simply needed to learn to let go, step aside, and hand over the reins to the youth who truly deserved them. A few uncomfortable chuckles rippled through the audience. Diane looked down at her hands, her shoulders slumping. I did not frown. I did not show a flicker of the cold, lethal thing burning in my chest. I simply smiled, raised my water glass toward Isabel in a gesture of complete, defeated surrender, and took a slow sip. I played the broken, clueless old man to perfection. She had no idea that the reins she believed she was gripping were already wound tight around her own throat. When the dessert course was served and the guests began to mingle, I leaned down, kissed Diane on the cheek, and told her I needed a little air. I slipped out the side doors into the crisp night, walked away from the bright entrance, and crossed to the far end of the sprawling parking lot. There, parked beneath a solitary street lamp, sat a sleek black sedan, engine off, the silhouette of a man in the driver's seat. As I approached, the window rolled down, and Gerald Whitfield looked out at me from the darkness, his face devoid of emotion, operating with the clinical calm of a commander on the eve of an offensive. I rested my hands on the door and asked for the final status. Gerald did not waste a syllable. He confirmed the default notices were fully notarized and the acceleration clause was active. Then he lifted a thick manila folder from the passenger seat and told me he had just concluded a private meeting with his contacts at the FBI field office. The Financial Crimes Unit had reviewed the forged collateral documents and the shell transfers. A federal warrant had been signed by a judge that afternoon, and given the scale of the fraud, the agents were already planning to execute it within the coming day. All he had done was make certain they understood the timing of the wedding, so that when they moved, they would find both suspects in one place. Everything was in position. The trap was locked. I stood in the quiet shadows of the lot, looking back at the glowing windows of the dining hall, where my son and his bride were celebrating their stolen fortune. Tomorrow they expected to walk down an aisle into a lifetime of luxury. Instead, they were going to walk straight into the machinery of federal justice. The morning of the wedding dawned brilliant and cloudless, casting a deceptively perfect light over the sprawling green lawns of the country club. The air was crisp, carrying the sweet scent of thousands of imported white roses, arranged along every archway and table, a monument to greed funded entirely by $2.5 million stolen dollars. As I helped Diane get ready, the contrast between her reality and the impending opulence broke something in me all over again. Against my desperate pleas, she insisted on attending. She fought through waves of deep, bone-chilling pain and relentless nausea, breathless and trembling, but her resolve was unbreakable. She simply wanted to see her only son married. She wanted to witness the milestone she had prayed to see since the day he was born. It took us nearly 2 hours to prepare. I helped her into her emerald silk dress, which now hung loosely over her frail frame. She sat at her vanity, her trembling hands slowly adjusting the chestnut wig, applying a delicate layer of makeup to mask the toll the neutralized chemotherapy had taken on her body. She looked at my reflection, offered a weak smile, and told me the day was about family, and that she would not let her illness cast a shadow over her son's happiness. I kissed the top of her head, my heart breaking for the unconditional love the boy she adored was busy exploiting. I transferred her into the wheelchair, packed her emergency medical supplies, and loaded us into the car. The drive was silent, heavy with the weight of the secret I carried. I parked near the grand entrance, settled Diane into her chair, and pushed her through the towering doors, and the scale of Isabel's ambition struck me like a physical blow. The ballroom was already packed with over 300 guests, most of them strangers. Isabel's high society real estate connections, wealthy brokers, luxury developers, and affluent clients she had invited solely to parade her new wealth. Waiters in crisp white circulated with silver trays of chilled champagne and delicate appetizers. A string quartet played softly from a raised balcony. Everywhere I looked, I saw my stolen retirement converted into ice sculptures, silk draperies, and towering walls of flowers. It was a sickening display of stolen triumph, and I walked straight through the heart of it with my dying wife. I navigated the wheelchair through the sea of expensive suits and designer gowns, drawing a mixture of polite nods and quick, uncomfortable glances. Diane kept her head held high, her hands resting elegantly in her lap, radiating a quiet, dignified grace that commanded far more respect than any of the borrowed splendor around her. We made our way toward the massive elevated head table at the far end of the room, draped in shimmering silver linen and cascading white orchids, and I parked her chair at her designated spot, locked the wheels, and made certain she had a clear view. She leaned back and closed her eyes for a moment to gather her strength, the chaotic noise of the reception clearly overwhelming her weakened senses. I stood close beside her, a silent, immovable guardian, scanning the room for the two people whose lives I was about to dismantle. The grand double doors at the entrance swung open and a hush fell over the crowd. The quartet transitioned into a triumphant, soaring melody as Marcus and Isabel made their grand entrance as husband and wife, stepping into a chorus of applause from their wealthy audience. Marcus wore a custom tuxedo, his face flushed, a forced plastic smile plastered across it. He looked exhausted, his eyes darting nervously, carrying the invisible, crushing weight of the federal fraud he had committed, moving with the rigid posture of a man waiting for a trapdoor to open beneath his feet. Isabel, however, was in her element. She floated in wearing a breathtaking custom gown encrusted with thousands of tiny crystals, waving to the cheering crowd, blowing kisses to her colleagues, soaking in the admiration and the envy like a sponge. She gripped my son's arm and steered him through the crowd with the aggressive confidence of a predator who had captured her prize. She had the mansion in Aspen, she had the lavish wedding, and she believed she had successfully neutralized my wife. She was intoxicated by her own perceived brilliance. They made their way toward the head table, pausing to pose for the team of professional photographers. As Isabel approached the platform, her practiced smile faltered. She stopped, her eyes locking onto the space where I had parked Diane's wheelchair. The distance between us was less than 15 feet, close enough for me to see the flash of pure irritation twist her contoured face. She did not see a mother fighting through agony to support her son. She did not see the woman whose treatment she had been sabotaging. She saw only a flaw in the visual perfection of her curated event, the metal frame of the wheelchair, the undeniable reality of illness, refusing to fit the flawless image she was projecting. One of her bridesmaids, a tall woman in pale pink silk, stepped up beside her, noticing the sudden halt. Isabel leaned her head toward her, never taking her cold eyes off my wife, and the loud music masked her words from the rest of the room. But I had positioned myself perfectly, and I heard the sharp, venomous whisper cut through the noise with chilling clarity. She let out a sigh of profound annoyance, gripping her bouquet until her knuckles paled, and muttered that the old woman was ruining the aesthetic of the wedding photos with her depressing, sickly aura. I stood silently beside my innocent wife, my heart turning to a solid block of ice. I placed my hand gently on Diane's trembling shoulder, offering the comfort she needed, while my eyes stayed fixed on Isabel. The trap was fully armed. The destruction of their stolen paradise was now inevitable. The dinner service dragged on for what felt like an eternity. Course after course of imported delicacies served on gold-rimmed china that glinted under the chandeliers. I sat perfectly still beside my wife, watching the opulent circus unfold with the detached observation of a coroner. The champagne flowed endlessly. Every clink of crystal, every burst of shallow networking laughter, was a fresh reminder of the stolen millions funding this grotesque charade. Marcus sat paralyzed at the center of the head table, having abandoned his meal to systematically drain glass after glass of dark bourbon. The liquor did nothing to still the frantic shifting of his eyes. He was a man waiting for an executioner he could not see, and he never once looked in our direction, never once checked whether his dying mother was comfortable. He simply stared at the silk tablecloth, drowning his cowardice in expensive alcohol. Isabel, by contrast, was thriving, moving through the ballroom with the manic energy of someone who believed she had conquered the world. The alcohol had stripped away her last thin layer of decency. She laughed too loudly, draped herself over the shoulders of wealthy developers, and demanded constant attention from everyone in the room. When she finally returned to the head table, she did not sit. She paced behind the chairs, her beaded gown rustling, shooting sharp, resentful glares toward my wife. Diane had barely touched her meal. The heavy floral perfume and the overwhelming noise were taking a brutal toll on her fragile system. She sat quietly, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her breathing shallow, doing everything in her power to remain invisible so her son could enjoy his day, entirely oblivious to the predatory gaze fixed on her from a few feet away. The clink of silver against crystal signaled the speeches, and the quartet faded into silence. Marcus was scheduled to speak first, according to the gold-embossed programs at every place setting, but Isabel did not allow it. Before my son could even attempt to stand, she snatched the microphone from the master of ceremonies, tapped the metallic grill twice, and stood at the very edge of the platform, looking down at the sea of faces with a wide, dangerous smile. She began with the standard hollow platitudes, thanking her wealthy colleagues, name-dropping developers, and speaking at length about her immaculate vision for the future. The massive architectural projects she planned to spearhead, now that she was a married woman with substantial new capital. She spoke exclusively about herself, her ambitions, her exquisite taste. She did not mention my son's name once in the first 5 minutes, and Marcus simply sat there staring into his empty glass, a pathetic accessory in her production. Then her tone changed. The practiced corporate sweetness evaporated, replaced by a slurred, aggressive edge. She took a slow sip from her flute and let out a harsh, echoing laugh, and told the room that weddings were historically about pretending, that for far too long society had forced people to hide behind polite smiles and manufactured perfection. She gripped the microphone tighter, her knuckles whitening, and announced that she was sick of pretending, that this new chapter of her life, funded by her own hard work and brilliant investments, would be defined by raw, unfiltered authenticity. The guests shifted uncomfortably. The wealthy brokers exchanged worried glances, uncertain whether this was planned entertainment or the beginning of a public meltdown. Isabel ignored the shifting mood and began pacing the front of the platform, her voice rising. She declared that her new family was going to stop hiding its ugly realities behind closed doors. She stated that weakness and fragility were pathetic anchors dragging successful people down. She preached that those who were strong, those who were beautiful and capable, had a moral obligation to prune away the dead branches of their lives. Her words were vicious daggers disguised as a bizarre motivational monologue, and the silence in the ballroom became suffocating. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting lightly on the handles of Diane's wheelchair, watching the beautiful, terrifying thing my son had chosen finally reveal her true face to the world. Then Isabel stopped pacing. She stood at the exact center of the platform, slowly lowered the champagne from her lips, and turned her entire body, ignoring the 300 guests, ignoring her paralyzed husband, until her cold, predatory eyes locked directly onto my frail wife. The spotlight followed her, casting a harsh beam over the corner of the table where Diane and I sat. She began to walk, slow, deliberate, stumbling steps, her beaded gown dragging across the polished wood, never breaking eye contact, the malicious smirk deepening with every step. She was no longer performing for the crowd. She was zeroing in on the weakest target in the room, driven by a cruel, intoxicated desire to display her absolute dominance. I felt a sharp tremor run through Diane's fragile body. My wife reached back, her cold fingers searching for my hand, and I intertwined mine with hers and gave a firm, silent squeeze. I kept my face entirely devoid of emotion, but every muscle in my body locked into place. Isabel raised the microphone back to her lips as she closed the final few feet. She let out a dramatic sigh and told the room that her wedding demanded absolute transparency, slurring slightly, the champagne muddling her words. She declared that for far too long the people in this family had hidden behind fake appearances. That weakness was a choice, a manipulative performance designed to steal attention from those who truly deserved the spotlight. Her eyes, dark and empty of any human warmth, bored into the terrified face of my wife. Diane shrank back against the leather of her wheelchair, her breathing shallow and erratic, and raised her frail hands to clutch the collar of her dress, bracing for a verbal assault. But Isabel was not satisfied with words. She wanted a physical demonstration of her dominance. She wanted to break the woman who had dared to bring the ugly reality of mortality into her glittering sanctuary. She took one final step, closing the distance. She issued no warning. She offered no final cutting remark. She simply reached out with her left hand, her manicured fingers curling like the talons of a bird of prey, and with a swift, violent motion, she seized a thick handful of Diane's chestnut wig and yanked her arm backward. My wife let out a sharp, breathless gasp of pure terror. The force snapped her head back against the wheelchair. The pins securing the synthetic hair to her fragile scalp tore free, and the wig came away entirely, dangling from Isabel's fist like a hunting trophy. She held it aloft for a fraction of a second, a deranged, victorious smirk twisting her face, and then casually tossed it over her shoulder, where it landed on the pristine white tablecloth, a dark, lifeless heap among the orchids and champagne flutes. The brilliant, unforgiving light of the chandeliers poured directly down onto my wife. Diane was left completely exposed, her bare scalp pale and marked by the harsh ravages of chemotherapy, laid bare before 300 wealthy strangers. She looked impossibly small, stripped of the last desperate layer of dignity she had fought so hard to keep. A guttural, agonizing sob tore from her throat, a sound of such profound humiliation that it will haunt my nightmares until the day I die. She brought her thin, trembling hands to her face, trying to hide from the hundreds of eyes suddenly fixed upon her, her narrow shoulders shaking as she wept, her small frame collapsing inward under the crushing weight of the public degradation. She had endured months of grueling treatment, faced the terror of her own mortality, and pushed through agonizing pain just to witness her son's happiness. And this was her reward. For 5 suffocating seconds, the ballroom was plunged into a dead silence, the wealthy elite frozen, their champagne glasses suspended in mid-air. Then the silence broke, not with an outcry of decency, but with something far worse. From the corner of the head table, the soft, cruel sound of drunken giggling erupted. Isabel's bridesmaids, clad in pale pink silk, were covering their mouths, exchanging amused, condescending glances as they looked at my weeping wife. Their laughter was a sickening endorsement of the atrocity that had just occurred. I turned my head slowly, away from the laughing women, and looked directly at my son. Marcus stood barely 10 feet away. He had watched his bride physically assault his dying mother. He had seen the bare, scarred scalp of the woman who raised him. He had heard her agonized sobs echo through the silent room. He had every opportunity to step forward, to be a man, to shield his mother from the cruelty he had brought into her life. Instead, Marcus took a distinct, deliberate step backward, lowered his head, stared at the floorboards, and did absolutely nothing. He surrendered completely to his cowardice, allowing the humiliation to continue, in absolute submission to the monster he had just married. The final lingering ember of hope I held for my family was permanently extinguished. The time for playing the weak and grieving father was over. I did not yell, I did not scream or curse or hurl my glass across the room. A public tantrum would only have fed the chaotic spectacle Isabel was so desperate to create. I possessed something far more dangerous than blind rage. I possessed absolute control over their entire future. I rose slowly from my chair. The movement was deliberate and unhurried, executed with the chilling precision of a judge, preparing to deliver a sentence, and it drew the immediate attention of the room. The cruel giggling from the bridesmaids died in their throats. I reached up and calmly unbuttoned my suit jacket, slipped it from my shoulders, and let the heavy fabric drape over my arm. I stepped forward, positioning my body between the blinding spotlight and my weeping wife, and I draped the dark jacket gently over Diane's bare head and shoulders, giving her a shield of privacy and dignity against the hundreds of staring eyes. I smoothed the lapels down around her neck and whispered a soft, steady promise that everything was going to be all right, that she was safe now. She clutched the wool with shaking fingers and buried her face in it. Once I was certain she was shielded, I turned around. I squared my shoulders, ignored the terrified crowd, and focused my entire being on the woman standing on the platform. I looked directly into Isabel's eyes and watched the arrogant, intoxicated triumph on her face slowly curdle into confusion. She had expected me to break down. She had expected me to cry or scream, to play the defeated victim. She had no idea she was looking into the eyes of the man who held the legal authority to seize her mansion, freeze her assets, and summon federal agents to lock her in a cell. I stepped away from the table and began the long, deliberate walk toward the center of the platform. My footsteps measured and unhurried against the polished hardwood. I wanted Isabel to feel the weight of my approach. I wanted every wealthy broker and socialite in that room to witness the precise moment the glittering illusion of her perfect life crumbled to dust. As I closed the distance, her confusion melted back into her toxic confidence. She believed my calm was submission, that like my cowardly son I was coming forward to apologize, to smooth over the awkwardness and surrender to her dominance in front of her peers. She stood beneath the harsh spotlight, the silver microphone still clutched in her hand, her chest heaving slightly from the alcohol and the adrenaline of her cruel stunt. When I was a few feet away, she leaned back and let out a soft, condescending chuckle, a sound designed to reduce me to the status of a defeated servant in front of her guests. I stopped directly in front of her. I did not let a single trace of the rage in my chest reach my face. I reached smoothly into the inner pocket of my remaining suit vest and drew out the thick manila envelope Gerald Whitfield had handed me the night before. The crisp paper caught the light of the chandeliers, a stark contrast to the glittering beads of her gown. Isabel looked down at the envelope, and her eyes gleamed with greedy certainty. She brought the microphone back to her red lips, turning her head so her voice would carry flawlessly over the sound system she had demanded, and smirked, a vicious, triumphant curl of the mouth. "Oh, look," she slurred smoothly, her voice bouncing off the mirrored walls. "The old man is finally handing over the warehouse deed. It certainly took you long enough to realize who's actually running this family." A low murmur rippled through the audience. A few guests clapped politely, foolishly, assuming this was some planned family moment. Marcus did not clap. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him finally lift his heavy head from the floor, his face drained of all color, staring at the thick white envelope with dawning terror. Perhaps recognizing the distinctive watermark of a premier Denver law firm, or perhaps simply understanding that I would never hand over the deed to my empire in such a quiet, defeated way. But Isabel noticed none of it. She was blinded by her own ravenous ambition. I held the envelope out. My hand was perfectly steady. She snatched it with the eager, violent grace of a starving animal, dug her sharp nails under the seal, and ripped the thick paper apart in her haste, tearing the top edge. She pulled out the dense stack of documents, and I watched her eyes dart to the top of the first page. I watched the exact fraction of a second when her alcohol-soaked brain finally processed the large, bold header printed across the premium paper. Notice of acceleration. Demand for payment in full. $2,500,000. The transformation was absolute and instant. The drunken flush vanished from her chest and neck, replaced by an ashen, sickly pallor. The mocking smirk was wiped away, her mouth hanging slightly open in pure shock. Her hands, which had so violently ripped the wig from my dying wife's head moments earlier, began to tremble uncontrollably, the pages rustling loudly against the microphone she still clutched. She blinked rapidly, her eyes scanning the dense legal text, desperately searching for a punchline, a mistake, a loophole. She read the clauses detailing the immediate seizure of the unlisted mansion in Aspen. She read the clauses freezing all secondary shell assets, And then she read the name of the anonymous trust that now held her fraudulent debt, and she saw my personal signature listed as its sole managing director. She slowly raised her wide eyes from the paper. The look she gave me was no longer predatory. It was the frantic, hollow stare of trapped prey, realizing the cage had already slammed shut. She took a stumbling step backward, the heel of her designer shoe catching on the hem of her gown, and turned her head frantically toward Marcus, in a silent, desperate plea for rescue. But my son was already retreating, backing away from the head table, pressing his shaking shoulders against the mirrored wall, looking as though he might be sick. He understood exactly what those papers meant. He knew the acceleration clause had been triggered. He knew they had a matter of days to produce $2.5 million in cash, or face immediate federal indictment for bank fraud. Isabel turned her face slowly back to me. Her glossy lips moved, but no sound came out. She looked down at the microphone in her hand as though she had forgotten what it was. I took one deliberate step forward, closing the last of the distance between us. I did not snatch the microphone from her trembling fingers. I simply leaned in, positioned my mouth inches from the silver grill, and in a room so quiet that even the hum of the building seemed to have vanished, with 300 wealthy guests holding their collective breath, I spoke with a cold, clear, lethal authority that resonated over every speaker. You didn't borrow from a bank, Isabel. You borrowed from me. And because you forged my signature to commit federal bank fraud, the loan is due now. The microphone slipped from her fingers and struck the platform with a deafening squeal of feedback that made guests in the front row flinch and cover their ears. She did not reach for it. She stumbled backward, her breath coming in short, erratic gasps, staring at me as though the devil himself had manifested in the middle of her fairy tale wedding. The heavy silence of the ballroom finally shattered into a rising, chaotic murmur from the 300 guests. From the far side of the platform came the frantic sound of heavy footsteps. Marcus scrambled up the side stairs, his face drained of every ounce of color, looking exactly like a man walking to his own public execution. He stepped between Isabel and me, raising his shaking hands in a pleading gesture, stammering, his voice cracking, asking me what all of this was. He begged me to listen, insisting they could explain everything, that this was a misunderstanding blown out of proportion, that we needed to step into a private room to sort out our family business. I bent down slowly and retrieved the microphone from the floor. I stood back up, my posture perfectly straight, and looked directly into my son's panicked eyes. I brought the microphone to my lips, ensuring my voice carried flawlessly over the sound system, and told him there was nothing left to explain. Then I turned my cold gaze out toward the massive sea of real estate brokers, luxury developers, and high society clients Isabel had so carefully invited to witness her social triumph, and I decided it was time to introduce them to the real Isabel. I spoke with brutal, clinical precision. I informed the entire room that the extravagant wedding they were attending had been funded entirely by stolen money. I detailed exactly how my son and his bride had forged my personal signature on federal documents to illegally secure a $2.5 million commercial loan against my logistics business. A sharp collective gasp rippled through the ballroom, and I watched as dozens of stunned guests, people whose professional lives depended on trust and financial integrity, pulled out their phones. The glowing screens illuminated the dim room as they began recording every word. I did not stop. I explained how they had funneled the stolen funds through a web of anonymous shell companies to hide their tracks. And I revealed that while they pretended to struggle financially, they had secretly purchased a sprawling, unlisted luxury mansion up in Aspen. I watched Isabel's pristine professional reputation disintegrate before my eyes. Her wealthy colleagues were no longer looking at her with admiration or envy. They were looking at her with pure, undeniable disgust. The social empire she had spent years aggressively building was burning to the ground in a matter of seconds. But the financial fraud was only the beginning. I turned my back on the stunned crowd and walked to the edge of the platform where my wife sat, silent and hidden beneath the drape of my jacket, gripping the fabric with pale, trembling fingers. I looked back at Isabel and let the full venom in my soul seep into my voice. I told the room that the money meant nothing to me. The true crime, the most unforgivable atrocity, was what they had done to the innocent woman who gave my son life. I told the hundreds of listening guests about the sudden, inexplicable decline in Diane's health over the past months. I explained how Isabel had played the role of the devoted daughter-in-law, brewing special herbal teas and holistic soup supposedly designed to aid her chemotherapy recovery. The crowd went silent again, hanging on every word with a dark, morbid fascination. And then I revealed that those loving remedies had been secretly laced with a concentrated botanical compound, deliberately calculated to strip her cancer medication out of her bloodstream and neutralize her treatment. They had not been trying to heal her. They had been methodically, patiently attempting to accelerate her death so they could seize the remainder of my estate without waiting for nature to take its course. The reaction was instantaneous and visceral. Several women cried out in genuine horror. Men shouted in outrage. The glowing sea of camera phones pressed closer to the stage, capturing the terror paralyzing the bride and groom. The public exposure broke whatever remained of Isabel's fragile, narcissistic composure. The crushing weight of the humiliation triggered a feral survival instinct. She lunged forward, pointing a trembling finger at my face, and began to scream at the top of her lungs, her voice cracking with hysterical panic. She shrieked that I was a senile old man inventing delusional lies to ruin her beautiful life. She tried desperately to convince her powerful colleagues that this was a pathetic, empty bluff staged by a bitter, controlling father who simply wanted to destroy her special day. She signaled frantically to the country club security guards at the perimeter, demanding they remove me from the premises immediately, screaming that I had no proof of these outrageous allegations, and that she would not let me destroy her flawless reputation. She took another aggressive step forward, her pale face twisting into a grotesque mask of desperation, looking as though she were preparing to physically shove me off the raised platform. But before she could close the distance, the heavy mahogany double doors at the main entrance of the ballroom swung open with a resounding, thunderous crash. The wood slammed against the plastered walls, instantly cutting off her shrill screaming, and every head in the crowded room turned toward the sudden noise. Standing perfectly framed in the grand entryway was my attorney, Gerald Whitfield, a thick black briefcase in his right hand, his expression carved from unforgiving granite. Flanking him on either side, moving with swift, synchronized authority, were three stern, heavily built men in dark tactical windbreakers. The gold shields of the Federal Bureau of Investigation gleamed on their belts. Gerald stepped fully into the brilliantly lit ballroom, and the three agents moved in formation around him, their boots thudding against the marble, bypassing the decorated tables, their unyielding expressions cutting a stark path through the paralyzed sea of socialites. There would be no polite summons. There would be no quiet negotiation with expensive defense attorneys. This was a direct public act of justice, precisely as I had orchestrated over the past grueling weeks. Isabel stood frozen on the platform, her manicured hands hovering uselessly in the air, the spotlight still illuminating her ashen, terrified face. The aggressive bravado that had fueled her assault on my wife had entirely evaporated, replaced by the primitive panic of a trapped animal. The lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a closely cropped haircut, reached the edge of the stage. He did not hesitate and did not offer a greeting. He firmly instructed Isabel to place her hands behind her back, stated her full legal name, and began reciting the list of federal charges she faced, explicitly naming the forged commercial loan documents, the illegal wire transfers to the anonymous accounts, and the fraudulent purchase of the Aspen property. Isabel recoiled as though physically struck. She took a frantic, stumbling step back, the crystal-encrusted train of her gown tangling around her ankles, and shrieked that they were making a catastrophic mistake, that she was a prominent, respected developer who could not be treated like a common criminal. The agents were entirely unfazed. Two of them stepped smoothly onto the platform, flanking her, and grasped her arms with practiced, immovable force. She thrashed violently, her diamond tiara slipping from her hair and clattering to the floor, and the sharp, unmistakable click of handcuffs echoed through the silent room like the final closing of a vault. Seeing his dominant bride reduced to a shrieking, restrained figure shattered whatever fragile barrier Marcus had been clinging to. He pushed himself away from the mirrored wall, his face streaked with sudden, desperate tears, scrambled across the stage, and threw himself onto his knees directly at my feet. He grabbed the fabric of my trousers with shaking, sweaty hands and looked up at me with a pathetic, childish terror, entirely ignoring the agent securing his new wife. He sobbed uncontrollably, begging me to stop them, pleading that we were family, that we could talk it out behind closed doors, swearing he never wanted any of this, that Isabel had manipulated him, that he was so incredibly sorry. I did not step back. I did not pull my legs from his grasp. I simply stood there and looked down at the weeping creature groveling on the floor, and I felt no warmth, no pity, and not a single flicker of the paternal instinct that had once defined my whole life. I looked into his red, swollen eyes, and I made certain he heard every syllable. I told him he had stood silently by while the woman he loved slowly and deliberately poisoned his own mother. I reminded him that he had chosen to look away, choosing cowardly submission over basic human decency. I pointed out that he had stood perfectly still and allowed his bride to rip the wig from his dying mother's head and had allowed those cruel bridesmaids to laugh at her humiliation. And I told him, clearly and with a devastating finality, that a man who could watch his innocent mother suffer such abuse for the sake of a stolen mansion was no longer part of my bloodline. I looked down at him with unyielding disgust and told him he was no son of mine. Marcus collapsed forward, burying his face against my shoes, wailing with a hollow, pathetic grief that generated no sympathy in me at all. I smoothly stepped out of his grasp, walked around his trembling body, and behind me, Isabel had lost the last of her composure entirely, screaming and kicking and twisting against the agent's grip, her shrieks of rage and denial echoing off the high ceilings as they marched her down the long center aisle. The 300 elite guests did not stay to offer support. The wealthy brokers and developers and socialites were already scrambling toward the side exits, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of a federal criminal investigation. The grand, opulent wedding had disintegrated into total, irreversible ruin. I turned my back on the chaos, dismissing my sobbing former son from my reality, and walked back to the edge of the table where my beloved wife waited. Diane was still trembling softly beneath the protective drape of my jacket. I knelt beside her wheelchair, placed my warm hands over her cold ones, and whispered that the nightmare was over, that the monsters had been removed from our lives, and that no one would ever be allowed to hurt or humiliate her again. Then I stood, gripped the handles of her chair, and without a single glance back at Marcus, weeping alone on the empty stage, I turned Diane around and pushed her slowly and carefully across the marble floor, past the overturned chairs and abandoned champagne flutes and scattered white roses, out of the ruined ballroom, leaving the smoldering remains of their stolen life behind us in the dark. The passage of 3 months felt less like the simple turning of calendar pages and more like emerging from a suffocating, lightless cavern into the warmth of a new morning. The fallout from that disastrous reception was swift, merciless, and absolutely final. Isabel and Marcus never saw the inside of a honeymoon suite. They were transported into federal custody, where they remained, held without bail. The scale and audacity of their financial crimes, combined with the compelling evidence of their tampering with my wife's medical treatment, prompted the judge to classify them both as extreme flight risks. The unlisted mansion in Aspen, along with the custom wardrobe, the diamonds, and the sleek new Porsche they had so arrogantly paraded around the city, were all seized by government authorities. The meticulously curated empire of lies they had built collapsed into a pile of worthless ash. I systematically and permanently divorced my son from every aspect of my life. I removed his name from all inheritance documents, severed every remaining familial tie, and ensured he would never again cast his shadow across our peaceful existence. He chose his path of greed and cowardice, and now he must walk it alone. The liquidation of their fraudulently acquired assets returned the stolen $2.5 million directly to my accounts. That recovered money did not sink back into a dormant retirement fund. Instead, it became the key that unlocked a miracle for the woman who deserved it most. We used those funds to enroll Diane in an exclusive cutting-edge immune cell therapy program at a premier oncology research center. Unburdened at last by the toxic soups Isabel had been secretly feeding her, Diane's fragile body finally had a genuine fighting chance to heal. The transformation over the last 90 days has been nothing short of breathtaking. This morning, the crisp autumn breeze sweeping in off the water at Sloan's Lake carried the unmistakable scent of hope. Diane and I sat quietly side by side on a weathered wooden bench, watching the gentle waves break against the shoreline. The folding wheelchair that had once confined her is completely gone. She sits upright now, her posture radiating a quiet strength that had been absent for far too long. The dark circles that used to bruise the skin beneath her eyes have faded, replaced by the warm flush of returning life. Her recent medical reports confirm what my own eyes can already plainly see. Her cancer markers are dropping with unprecedented speed. The therapy is working, targeting and destroying the illness that nearly stole her from me. I reached over and gently took her hand, marveling at the warmth returning to her fingers, and I looked at her head, deeply moved by the sight of her own natural hair beginning to grow back. A soft, elegant crown of silver and chestnut curls is slowly replacing the painful, scarred reality she endured beneath those ballroom lights. She turned her face toward the morning sun, closed her eyes, and drew a deep, unhindered breath of the fresh lake air, and a serene smile touched her lips, completely free of the crushing weight of betrayal that had suffocated our home for the better part of a year. We excised the malignant cancer from our family tree just in time. The toxic greed and profound cruelty that Marcus and Isabel carried into our lives has been completely eradicated, leaving behind an unbreakable peace. We lost a son to the corrupting allure of wealth and status, but in that painful, necessary severance, we reclaimed our own lives. As I sat there holding my wife's hand, watching the golden light dance across the rippling surface of the deep blue water, I knew with unwavering certainty that our story was never going to end in a quiet, tragic defeat. The chilling memory of that ruined ballroom already feels distant, washed away by the steady, comforting rhythm of the waves. We no longer look back at the shattered remnants of that dark past. We only look forward to the beautiful mornings we still have left to share. We survived the darkest, most treacherous storm of our entire lives, and we survived it together. I have had these 3 quiet months to sit with everything that happened, and I want to share with you what the wreckage finally taught me, because I suspect some of you have a version of this same story right now, and you may need to hear it from someone who has already walked the length of that dark corridor and come out the other side. We are told, from the time we are small, that family is an unbreakable bond, that blood is thicker than water, that we owe an unconditional loyalty to the people we are related to, no matter what they do to us. And there is a beautiful truth buried in that idea. But there is also a quiet trap inside it, because shared blood does not grant anyone a license to abuse you, to manipulate you, or to strip you of your dignity and call it love. For most of my life, I confused endurance with devotion. I believed that the measure of a good father was how much he was willing to give, how much he was willing to overlook, how many times he would open his hand, no matter how often it was bitten. I was wrong. Love that only ever flows in one direction is not love, it is harvest. The hardest thing I ever had to learn at 70 years old is that setting a firm boundary with someone you love is not an act of cruelty. When those closest to you begin wearing masks of affection to reach past your defenses and take what they want, drawing a line is not betrayal. It is survival, and it is not too late to draw it. It was not too late for me, and it is not too late for you. I want to say something in particular to those of you who are caring for an aging parent, or a sick spouse, or anyone who has grown vulnerable and can no longer protect themselves. The people in our lives who are weakest are the ones predators circle first, because they are the easiest to isolate, the easiest to silence, the easiest to convince that speaking up would only cause trouble. My Diane drank poison every morning for 2 weeks and said nothing, because she did not want to seem ungrateful. That is what cruelty does to a gentle person. It uses their own goodness against them. So watch over the quiet ones. Believe them when something feels wrong. Ask the questions they are too kind to ask for themselves. Vigilance, in the defense of someone who cannot defend themselves, is one of the purest forms of love there is. And here is the part I most want you to carry with you. I never once raised my hand or my voice. I did not need to. The temptation when we are wronged is to meet cruelty with cruelty, to scream, to lash out, to become for one satisfying moment as ugly as the person who hurt us. But rage is loud and hollow, and it almost always costs you more than it costs your enemy. Real strength is quiet. It is patient. It gathers the facts, protects the innocent, and lets the consequences a person has earned arrive at their own door in their own time. I did not destroy Marcus and Isabel. They destroyed themselves. I simply refused to keep catching them before they hit the ground. Do not let guilt over a family tie chain you to someone who is quietly bleeding you dry. Do not mistake your own patience for a virtue when it has become a permission slip for someone else's cruelty. Protect your peace, safeguard the people and the legacy you have spent a lifetime building, and understand that sometimes the greatest victory available to you is not revenge at all. It is simply walking away, upright and unbroken, with the person you love still holding your hand. Diane's hair is growing back. Some mornings I catch her laughing at something on the radio, a sound I was certain I had lost forever, and I have to step out of the room so she does not see her old husband cry. We do not have our son anymore, but we have each other, and we have our peace, and after everything, I have come to understand that peace was always the more precious of the two things I was fighting for. If this story opened your eyes, or reached some quiet place inside you that has been waiting a long time to hear it, please take a moment to tap the like button and subscribe to my channel, so that the next story finds its way to you, and you never miss what comes next. And if you have ever had to set a boundary with a toxic family member, or found the strength to walk away from someone you were told you owed everything to, I would be honored if you shared your experience in the comments below. I read every single one of them, and there is someone scrolling through them tonight who needs to know they are not alone. Every word of this story was written, shaped, and told by a human being, drawn from the kinds of betrayals real families endure behind closed doors and reflected on with a human heart. The names, the places, and certain details have been changed to protect privacy and to honor the dignity of the people whose pain inspired it. This was not generated by a machine. It was written by someone who believes these stories matter, and who believes that you, sitting there listening, matter too. Thank you for spending this time with me. I will see you in the next one.